The focus of today's lecture is going to be on the institutionalization of the Society of Jesus in under the generates of his three immediate successors, Lainez, Borgia, and Mercurian. And the spiritual focus of today's lecture is going to be on analyzing what spirits were at work in that process of institutionalization. As the society tried to figure out how to continue without St. Ignatius there to guide it, as the society passed into the hands not just of Ignatius' successors, but eventually into a generation of Jesuits that were not there at the founding, some of whom eventually had a lesser and lesser bond with the original companions founded the society. During this period, there was real concern about how to stay true to the spirit of St. Ignatius and the spirit of the early Society of Jesus. And the question is, how well did they discern that? How well did the early Jesuits discern how to remain true to who we are as Jesuits in a world without St. Ignatius and his companions? So that is something that I think can teach us a lot about how we discern by analyzing what spirits were guiding those discernments and what was the good part of that discernment, or what was the challenging, the difficult, or even the wrong part of that discernment in which the society engaged at its highest levels. So the rule for the discernment of spirits that I want to look at is from the second week of the rules for the discernment of spirits, the third rule, which is, with or by means of a preceding cause, both the good angel and the evil angel are able to cause consolation in the soul, but for their contrary purposes. The good angel acts for the progress of the soul, that it may grow and rise from what is good to what is better. The evil angel works for the contrary purpose, that is, to entice the soul to its own damnable intention and malice. So one of the things that's going to be true about this particular period in the society's history is that there's going to be a greater degree of subtlety in the spirits that are at work. The consolations are going to be there, but the question is, are they true consolations that come from the Spirit of God, or are they false consolations that are leading us, as Ignatius talks about in this rule, to lesser goods, toward things that are not good at all, towards evil. So that's why it's good to be in the second week of the rules of discernment, because this is a time when there's not necessarily going to be a lot of clear-cut answers on what the discernment is. But I think that this is a space that we live in a lot as Jesuits, where we need to be aware of the subtle things that are impacting us, the subtle attachments, the subtle fears that can impact our discernments, as well as the subtle joys and the subtle encouragements that the good spirit, the God spirit, leads us to embrace. And a lot of this subtlety, as I've already indicated, revolves around how to stay true to the spirit of the society as it was founded, the spirit of Ignatius and the spirit under which the society was founded. At the time of the First General Congregation, the Pope is Pope Paul IV, and Paul IV has made these decisions that the society needs to change two things in its institute. Number one, it needs to take up the traditional practice of religious, that is, of praying the Liturgy of the Hours, the office, in common in choir. For a lot of people, Paul IV included, this was the mark of what it meant to be a religious, right? Going all the way back to the original Western religious, the Benedictines, who prayed the Liturgy of the Hours in common, and that's a defining aspect of their spirituality and of their life together. Ignatius, of course, didn't want us to pray the Liturgy of the Hours as an obligation together and in choir, because it was going to take a lot of time, and it was going to therefore make us less available to be on mission. He wanted us not to be tied to specific times and places in the way that requirement would tie us. But Pope Paul IV does not see it that way, and he obliges the society to take up this regular practice. And he also obliges the society to start having terms term limits, terms for their superior general. The society is going to have to gather every 3 years to elect a new superior general, to have regular religious chapters like other religious orders. Now, what happens with these changes is that when Paul the Fourth dies, only about a year after the general congregation has occurred, the Jesuits consult with canon lawyers, and they determine that these changes are because they were not written down, they are not obligatory after the death of the Pope who issued them. So the canon lawyers encourage the Jesuits to just continue on with their constitutions because these changes are no longer in effect. The thing is, Lainez has a lot of scruples about this. And when the 3 years comes up for his term as general, according to Pope Paul IV's decree, he starts wondering if maybe he should stop being superior general, if maybe they should elect someone new. He's gotten over, apparently, the concern about choir, but he thinks that this one, maybe this is something that he should do. And maybe it's a scruple, or maybe it's a desire on his part to not be general. What he does is he sends out a letter in 1560 to all of the 60 professed fathers of the Society of Jesus, and he asks their opinion about whether there should be a new election for superior general. And he writes, just to quote part of his letter, "In favor of a new election, the first and principal reason which occurs to me, and one sufficient by itself, is that having pondered upon the qualities required by the constitutions in general, I find I possess practically none of them, either interiorly or exteriorly, except perhaps a little goodwill and fidelity to the society, and a little learning spoiled by want of steady application. I humbly beseech each of you, if the service of our Lord is unaffected, to relieve me of this burden, which is too great for my shoulders." Now, the interesting thing is that in theory, he's engaging in this consultation because he's worried that Pope Paul IV's decree is still in effect. But the reasons that he gives for stopping to be general is that he doesn't think he's a very good general, which would suggest a different spirit at work, a spirit of sort of a false humility driving him, rather than a spirit of fidelity to the Pope. I just want to read you 3 excerpts from the responses. We have the responses of the 60 professed fathers to this request, and I want to read you 3 excerpts from the responses. Pierre Peltier says, "The office of general is a burden, so much that I would consider him to be a great lunatic who showed a preference for it over the office of cook in the curial kitchen." This is just a bit of Peltier's response, and his point is, of course you don't want to be General Lainez, but that has nothing to do with it. If you did want to be general, we'd be concerned about your sanity. Nicholas Bobadilla, who had caused all this trouble at the Jerusalem congregation, and he didn't like the constitutions, he didn't want the governance of the society to be done all the way it was, and et cetera, et cetera. This is what he has to say. "My vote is that the generalate be always for life, according to the constitutions." According to the constitutions, that's what he says. "In the case of your reverence," meaning in the case of Lainez, "I wish the office to be so firmly established that it may last for 100 years, and that if you die, you may immediately be resurrected and confirmed in office until the day of universal judgment." Bobadilla was somebody who, it seems, ran either hot or cold. And whatever his objections to the constitutions, whatever his fights with the Nadal and Polanco, and a little bit with Lainez of the First General Congregation, apparently he is thoroughly in favor of keeping the plan for the generalate to be life, and very in favor of Lainez's leadership. Peter Canisius has this to say. Father Lannoy, who is another Jesuit who lived with Canisius, and I agree together that despite what Pope Paul IV did, the will of the Reverend Father Ignatius ought to be preserved regarding the superior general, that it should not be laid aside or changed, except in the cases expressed in the constitutions. So here's the end of this story is that in June of 1561, Pope Pius IV actually formally annulled the decree of Pope Paul IV, affirming the constitutions in the lifetime generalate of the superiors general of the Society of Jesus. So But what the responses that we heard and what the general controversy reminds us of is the uncertainties of this time post Saint Ignatius. There's this worry: what's the best way to do this? Who's the best general? How do we maintain our relationship with the papacy? How do we maintain our fidelity to the constitutions? There's all this worry, all this angst in the society about how to proceed, and the angst of kind of being without Ignatius opens up the society to attachments to specific things that Ignatius said, or to doubts, like in the part of Lainez, about his ability to govern. It opens us up to all sorts of things, all sorts of subtle things where, Lainez might have felt a certain consolation at thinking, oh, maybe I don't have to be general anymore. But is that a consolation that comes from God, or is that a consolation that doesn't? What is it? What's his motive there? Is his motive fidelity, or is his motive false humility, as I mentioned earlier? So these are the sorts of subtleties and problems that come up for the society, sort of a good example for us to start on. I'm not going to dwell a lot on the details of what happened in the society under the generalates of Diego Lainez, Francis Borgia, and Everard Mercurian. I really want to focus on some things related to governance, because that's the main place where I want to talk about discernment at this time. But we have a continued growth of the society under these three generals. So Diego Lainez is elected general in 1558, and he's general until 1565. At his death, there are 3,500 Jesuits. Borgia is elected in 1565 and is general until 1572, and there's 3,905 Jesuits at his death. And Everard Mercurian is elected in 1573 and is general until 1580, and there are 5,165 Jesuits at his death. So there's continued growth of the society under each one of these generals. Interestingly enough, all of these generals are generals who knew St. Ignatius. All of these are generals who of course, Lainez is one of the original companions, and both Borgia and Mercurian entered while Ignatius was still general. Both of them, Borgia and Mercurian, entered in 1548. So there is a great amount of continuity, but there's still this concern that continuity does not extend, of course, to the younger Jesuits and to the ever-expanding ranks of the Jesuits. And one of the prime people who becomes really important in sort of cementing the way that the Jesuits proceed and sort of teaching our way of proceeding, to use that customary Jesuit phrase, to the society, so that we remain united in who we are and what we're doing, is Jerome Nadal. Nadal becomes very important in sort of giving an esprit de corps to the Society of Jesus. He's the founder of one of the first Jesuit school for lay people in Messina. He was the founding rector. He's there in Messina in 1550 when he's the one who gives the recommendation to St. Ignatius that we found the first novitiate. And he starts helping Ignatius with the constitutions through his role in Messina, because some of what he writes about the way that the school at Messina was run is influential in sort of what Ignatius eventually puts into the constitutions on the part on education. So Nadal has this very early role, and he's somebody who Ignatius himself says really understands his mind. And starting in 1552, Nadal becomes the commissary of Ignatius in Spain, meaning that he has kind of a higher authority, a kind of an independent authority of the provincials, and he goes to Spain to start teaching all these Jesuit recruits, all these new Jesuits, what it means to be a Jesuit. And really, this starts the whole process of the rest of Nadal's life. Nadal's kind of specialty is teaching Jesuits how to be Jesuits. So, for example, if you've ever heard Jesuit formation compared to the life of Ignatius, the different parts of our formation, our experiments in the novitiate, as well as the stages of our formation, are based and modeled on the different things Ignatius had in his own spiritual journey and formation. If you've ever heard that, and I imagine most, if not all of you have heard that, that's Nadal. Nadal's the one who comes up with this idea that the life of Ignatius is sort of the paradigm of how we are supposed to be formed as Jesuits. And if you've ever heard the expression that the road is our home, or if you've ever said or had said to you that we're not monks, that's Nadal. That's Nadal. Nadal is sort of the coiner of a lot of phrases that we use. He's the one who kind of explains some of the things that were implicit among the early companions. He explains that in a way that becomes kind of normative for the way that we go forward as Jesuits. So the interesting thing is that, of course, being the one who explains the society in more explicit ways also means that Nadal is interpreting. Ignatius didn't explain Jesuit formation in terms of his own life. That was very much not his style, to be so self-referential. But we think about it that way. Is that a bad thing? I don't think it's a bad thing at all. But it is the beginning of a process of institutionalization in the society. It's the beginning of a process of, okay, we don't have our relationships with our founders anymore. And so we need ways of knowing our founder. We need ways of knowing how to proceed as a Jesuit. We need ways of understanding what it means to proceed along the Jesuit way. So Nadal is the great explainer. He's also the great defender of the Society of Jesus. You know, the Society of Jesus is still suffering a lot of attacks for its orthodoxy, or people who are concerned that we're heretics, or we're, you know, engaged in something more nefarious than we're engaged in. All the usual accusations against the society. And Nadal's a great one for defending it. In particular, he defends the spiritual exercises, because the spiritual exercises from some very high-ranking people, including a very famous theologian, very important theologian in the history of the church, Melchior Cano, a Dominican, he hates the spiritual exercises. He basically thinks they're heresy. And so Nadal is one of the people who's defending the exercises. And the way that he defends them is he says, well, you know, they're not that original. They're in keeping with the tradition of the church. And he's the first one to take this very traditional Catholic spiritual teaching that the process of the spiritual life starts with, this process of the spiritual life starts with purgation and proceeds to illumination and then goes to union. This is kind of an old medieval way of thinking about that. First, we purge ourselves of then of the bad things, sin, evil, etc., etc. That's the first kind of spiritual life. Then the second level of the spiritual life is illumination, where we gain in wisdom and knowledge of Christ. And then eventually there's union with Christ, sort of mystical union with Christ, where we've kind of gone beyond knowledge and learning, and it's more more sort of in the silent union that we have with God. And Nadal decides to compare, to say, well, look, that's the exercises. The exercises, week 1 is purgation, and, you know, week 2 is illumination. But then by week 4, we're in union with God. There's an advantage and a disadvantage to what he does there. I don't think that Ignatius thought about the spiritual exercises in those terms. I don't think that that's an accurate description of how the exercises worked. But it becomes the way that the exercises are understood by a lot of people for a long time. I would myself argue that the notion of union it's not this sort of mystical union where we've gone beyond language and expression, all that sort of stuff, gone beyond imagination into sort of the silence with God. That's not really Jesuit spirituality, according to the exercises, in my opinion. You can argue with me if you'd like. And so he's kind of changing a little bit about the exercises and the way that they're understood by using this language. But he's defending the exercises against our critics and trying to say we're not unorthodox, we're not outside of the Catholic tradition. So there's this two-edged aspect of what's going on. And the question, again, is, well, what's the spirit at work? Is Nadal kind of giving in to fears and getting defensive, and so unintentionally surrendering important things about who we are and our spirituality? Or is Nadal, properly continuing the adaptation of the society and its self-understanding, so that we can get along in the church, so that we can continue in our mission. This is always the question with institutionalization: what is lost and what is gained as we kind of come up with standard ways of thinking about things and doing things. Nadal is also one of the ones who comes up with the idea that we should make the exercises every year. The original idea was not that there'd be an 8-day retreat every year. The original idea was, well, you'd make the full exercises in your formation, but then that would be it, or at least that seems to be what Ignatius and the first companions were thinking. But Nadal starts encouraging we should redo the exercises. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. I love doing my exercises every year, but it is a change. It is a change. And we do have to ask, is that a change because we're worried that we don't pray enough? So we're worried that, and are we worried that we don't pray enough because of what other people think of us? And is that a good motive? Or are we worried that we don't pray enough because we need to stay true to who we are as Jesuits? This is this tension that exists at this time. By the way, the rule to make us all make a version of the exercises, an 8-day version of the exercises every year, is going to be enshrined by the 6th General Congregation in 1608, but the practice is really encouraged by Nadal right from the beginning. I think in all of this, there's kind of an important question that we need to think about institutionalization during these generalates, which is the institutionalization of rules in the Society of Jesus, which is the last major topic that I want to talk about. There's levels of rules in the society. There's the things that pertain to the Institute, the papal decrees, the formulas of the Institute, 1540 and 1550, and other papal documents. And of course, those we can't reform. Those are in the hands of the Pope, and those are fundamental. Then there's the constitutions, which have a great deal of flexibility. As we know, they're not a rigid document, but they are a document. Part of the reason why they're not rigidly arranged is because the constitutions are intended to be perennially relevant. And now, of course, they have been, they could be, and they were always able to be, and they have been amended and changed over the history of the society. But the overall vision of the society that's presented in the constitutions is one that is kind of always valid. But there's another level of rules in the society, which is all of the common rules that are created. Ignatius writes rules for superiors and rules for houses, and Nadal writes tons of rules. He goes places and he writes rules for the particular community. And now we have rules. We have rules for the relationship between a director of work and a superior. It's a separate book. We have the religious statutes on religious poverty. We have all sorts of other documents that are lesser rules. And Nadal is a great one. And this period of the society under Lainez, Mercurian, and Borgia is a great time of the multiplication of the rules. But the thing that becomes very important is that Borgia is given the task by the Second General Congregation, the congregation that elects him in 1565, to revise all the rules in the society except for the constitutions. Okay, well, that makes sense because the rules are not perennially relevant. The rules are particular to times and places and situations. That's the vision of the rules. The constitutions and the formulas, they're always going to work, and they're always going to be valid and wise, and they're going to help us to understand who we are and what we're supposed to do as Jesuits. But the rules, the particular ways that houses and structures and houses and works are organized, they're going to be contingent upon the circumstances of the location, the circumstances of the moment, the culture, the church, etc., etc. So it makes sense that in 1565, the General Congregation asked Borgia to revise the rules, and the there's a continual revision of all these different rules, specific jobs, specific relationships, specific communities, all the way until 1580, during the Generalate of Mercurian. And then it stops. From 1580 until 1923, from 1580 until 1923, we don't really revise all these lesser rules, all the little things about how a house is supposed to be run, or how a novitiate is supposed to be run, or a specific job, the job of the minister, the job of the treasurer, the job, etc., etc. All these little rules about the way that kind of the minutia of our daily life and work, it gets set in stone in 1580 and just stays that way in the 1600s and 1700s and the 1800s, all the way until the 20th century. Now, what's the spirit at work there? The idea, it seems, that Ignatius had was the constitutions are written in broad general terms so that they can be perennially relevant. The rules are written in a way that are very specific because they're supposed to be very helpful and practical, but therefore they were meant to be changed and revised. So why did we stop revising them? It seems like we stopped revising them because we started thinking the rules are what make us Jesuits. The rules are how we stay true to St. Ignatius and the early society. And we're afraid to make these things, we're afraid to adapt these things. But adapting to the situation where we find ourselves is part of what makes us Jesuits. That's how we become available, is through our spirit, which is completely devoted to Christ, completely devoted to Christ's church, but adaptable in the way that we serve. But we stop adapting. We stop adapting and we fix things in stone. We fix even more things in stone under the next Generalate, under the Generalate of Aquaviva. And the question is, what's the spirit at work there? What's the spirit at work in at the same time in the fact that Borgia, after the second General Congregation elects him, makes it mandatory that every Jesuit pray for an hour every day, in direct contradiction of what Ignatius said on prayer. Ignatius said that the professed are only obliged to pray their examens and then their liturgical prayer obligations, because Ignatius thought we don't need to prescribe prayer. The professed will know they need to pray, but the professed will also have the leeway to adapt to the kind of prayer that they need. So in that case, it's not even staying true to the rules that Ignatius established. It's actually contradicting the way that Ignatius thought that we were supposed to proceed. It's making the society a little bit more rigid in its rules as opposed to adaptable in its style. What's the spirit at work there? It seems like a consoling thing to have a nice, orderly life. We all, a lot of us really like, it's good, clear rules. They're very good. And it's very appealing to have a lot of prayer. Hopefully all of us like to pray and think that prayer is important to our lives. And so it's really appealing. It's really consoling. But the question that we need to ask at this time is, where's the consolation coming from? Is the consolation coming from the fact that this is assuaging our fears, that we're losing touch with St. Ignatius? Or is it really coming from the living God? That's the question in the institutionalization of the society. What's the motive? And that's the question that I think we need to ask at this period of time. These are good Jesuits, and good things are happening in the society. But we have to ask, are we being driven by fears, or are we being driven by our hopes and by the consolations of God? Thank you.